I took the job because it was steady work, because it kept me fed, because someone had to do it. They told me I'd get used to the smell, and I did. What they didn't tell me was that I'd get used to everything else, to the things I found in the tanks, the containers they brought down every few days, the way certain people just stopped showing up in the corridors. By the time I understood what I was really disposing of, I'd already cashed too many paychecks to walk away. That's what I told myself, anyway. Truth was simpler. I was down to half a can of pork and beans and 2 Stimpaks I'd been rationing for 3 weeks. When the superintendent found me at the market trying to trade a bent fork for purified water, he didn't waste time with pleasantries. Just said they had an opening in waste reclamation, asked if I could start that afternoon. I said yes before he finished talking. He walked me down through the carrier's guts, past the residential sections where families had hung laundry between pipes, past the science lab where I could hear someone arguing about soil samples. We kept descending. The air changed, got heavier, damper, started to smell like metal and something organic I couldn't place. He didn't explain much, said the previous worker had left suddenly. Didn't say why, didn't need to, I figured. Jobs like this, people left when they could afford to. We stopped at a hatch marked with faded yellow stenciling. The superintendent pulled it open and the smell hit me, full sewage and chemicals and rot, but underneath that, something sweeter. Made my throat close up. Shifts 12 hours, he said. You process waste from the habitation decks, maintain the filtration system, and handle disposal. Buckets are in the corner. Masks are on the shelf, but they don't help much. He handed me a rusted key. Lock up when you're done. Don't let anyone in without clearance from me or security. What kind of clearance? He looked at me like I'd asked a stupid question. The kind they'll show you if they have it. Then he left, just turned and walked back up the corridor, and I stood there, holding a key to a room that smelled like death had moved in and started a family. The space was bigger than I'd expected. Old naval equipment still bolted to the walls, valves and gauges that probably hadn't worked in 2 centuries. Someone had jury-rigged a filtration system using pre-war machinery and what looked like Brahmin intestines stretched over frames. In the center sat 3 large concrete tanks, their surfaces dark with buildup. Pipes fed into them from above, dripping intermittently. Against the far wall, plastic buckets were stacked beside a wheeled cart. A single light fixture buzzed overhead, casting everything in sour yellow. I found the masks, pulled one on. It didn't help. The first day, I just tried to understand the system. Followed the pipes, checked the valves, figured out which tank was which. One held grey water runoff from sinks and showers. Another held what came from the toilets. The third held something else, darker, thicker. That one didn't have a label. The pipes leading to it came from a different section of the ship, somewhere I didn't recognize. The filtration system worked in stages, or was supposed to. Water passed through the Brahmin gut filters, then through sand and charcoal someone had packed into old fuel drums, then into a final holding tank that fed back into Rivet City's water supply. Not the drinking water that came from the purifier plant on the mainland, but the water used for washing, for the crops, for cooling systems. The water people didn't think about. My job was keeping the filters clear, emptying the solid waste into buckets, carting those buckets up to a disposal chute that dumped into the Potomac. 12 hours of scooping shit and changing filters and trying not to vomit into my mask. I lasted 6 hours that first day. By the time I stumbled back to my quarters in the common section, I'd already decided I'd quit in the morning, find something else, anything else. I lay on my bunk and smelled myself. The stink had soaked into my clothes, my hair, my skin. I could taste it. But in the morning, the superintendent was waiting outside my door with a bag. Inside was 200 caps, a week's advance pay. He said I'd done good work. Said the previous worker hadn't lasted past the first afternoon. I bought food, real food, not just beans or radroach meat, but vegetables from the hydroponic gardens, a tin of preserved peaches, even a bottle of Nuka-Cola. Sat in my quarters and ate until my stomach hurt, and I didn't think about the smell still clinging to my hands. I went back that afternoon. The work fell into rhythm after the first week. I learned which valves to check first, which filters clogged fastest, how to lift the buckets without sloshing. The smell stopped bothering me as much, or maybe I just stopped noticing. Hard to tell the difference. I saw other workers sometimes, maintenance crew passing through the lower decks on their way to check hull integrity or repair wiring. They never came into my section. When I passed them in the corridors, they'd look away, walk a little faster. Like what I did was contagious. Only person who talked to me regular was Harkness, the head of security. He'd stop by once a week, lean against the hatch frame, ask how things were running. Never came inside, just stood there in his coat, watching me work. After a few visits, I asked him why he checked in personally instead of sending one of his officers. "Someone needs to," he said. "Job like this, easy to forget there's a person doing it." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. "You see anything unusual?" he continued. "Anything that doesn't seem right? You come find me. Don't report it to the superintendent. You understand?" I said I did, even though I didn't really. What counted as unusual in a room full of shit and decay? But Harkness seemed serious about it, so I kept it in mind. The third week, I found something in the unlabeled tank. I'd been fishing out a clog in the intake pipe, reaching in with the long hook they'd left for the purpose, when I pulled up something that wasn't waste. Cloth, I thought at first, but wrong texture. I lifted it out, let it drip, held it up to the light. A shirt. Small, child-sized, with faded cartoon characters on the front, some pre-war mascot I didn't recognize, smiling despite the rot. I stood there holding it for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Kids' clothes ended up in the wash water sometimes, sure, but this hadn't come through the grey water tank. This had come from the unmarked line, the one I hadn't traced yet. I set it aside, finished my shift, locked up. That night I couldn't sleep, kept seeing that shirt, those stupid cartoon characters, kept wondering why it had been in that tank and not the regular waste system. Kept telling myself it didn't matter, that questioning it wouldn't change anything, that I needed this job and the caps it brought. In the morning, I went looking for where that pipe originated. The ship's layout wasn't intuitive. Centuries of jury rigging had created a maze of repurposed corridors and sealed sections. I followed the pipe as best I could, through crawl spaces and behind bulkheads, marking my path with chalk. It led deeper into the carrier, past areas I'd never seen, until finally it disappeared through a hatch with a proper pre-war lock still intact. I tried the hatch. Locked, of course. But the frame had rusted around the edges, and when I put my weight into it, it shifted. Not much. Just enough to see that the lock wasn't what was holding it closed. Someone had welded it shut from the other side. I went back to work. That shift, I paid more attention to the unlabeled tank. Watched what came through the pipe. Mostly it was what I'd expected: organic waste, chemicals, the usual refuse. But every few hours, something else would come through. Sometimes cloth, sometimes things that looked like medical waste, bandages crusted with old blood. Once, something that could have been hair, matted and grey. I started keeping track, made marks on the wall where no one would see, little tallies for each time something passed through that wasn't waste. By the end of the week, I had 14 marks. I thought about telling Harkness. Remembered what he'd said about reporting unusual things. But then I thought about what I'd actually tell him: that I found a child's shirt in a tank, that sometimes hair came through the pipes. He'd ask questions I couldn't answer, and then maybe I wouldn't have this job anymore, and then I'd be back to trading bent forks for water. So I kept working, kept counting. The superintendent came by one morning, asked how I was settling in, said I was doing better than expected, that the system was running cleaner than it had in months. He seemed pleased, told me there'd be a bonus in next week's pay, an extra 50 caps for good performance. I thanked him, tried to sound grateful. "You haven't had any problems?" he asked. Nothing unusual? The way he said it, careful, deliberate, made me think he already knew the answer, that he was testing whether I'd lie. No problems, I said. Everything's running smooth. He nodded, looked almost relieved. Good. That's good. Some workers, they get ideas. Start seeing things that aren't there. Start asking questions about systems they don't understand. Creates problems. I understand. I think you do, he said. I think that's why you'll work out just fine. After he left, I stared at the tanks for a while, at the pipes feeding them, at the filters I cleaned every day. Started thinking about what working out just fine meant to someone like him. Started wondering what had happened to the last worker, the one who hadn't lasted past the first afternoon. Started wondering if they'd asked questions. I kept my head down after that. Did my job, collected my pay, didn't poke around, told myself that whatever was happening, it wasn't my business. Rivet City was safer than anywhere else in the wasteland. They had walls, security, rules. If something wasn't right, that was for people above my pay grade to handle. But I couldn't stop noticing things. Like how the flow from the unmarked pipe increased after certain events. When there was a security incident, when someone got caught stealing or fighting, the pipe would run heavier the next day. When that scavenger crew came back sick from a run to the super-duper mart, half of them coughing blood, the pipe ran darker for a week. Like how certain names stopped appearing on the duty rosters. People I'd seen around the market, people who'd been part of the community, just gone one day. And when I'd ask about them casually, where'd that guy with the Brahmin jacket go? Haven't seen the woman from the clinic lately, people would get vague. Moved on, went topside. Transferred to another settlement. Nobody ever came right out and said they didn't know. They always had an answer. But the answers never quite felt true. I started paying attention to security patrols. Noticed they had a pattern every 3 days. Just after midnight, 2 officers would head down to the lower decks with a wheeled cart. They'd disappear for about an hour, then come back up without the cart. I never saw what was on it. They always covered it with canvas. One night I hid in a maintenance alcove, waited for them to pass. Followed at a distance, careful to stay quiet, to keep to the shadows. They went down to a section I'd never visited, past the crew quarters and storage areas, to a part of the ship that still had some of its original signage. Medical. They stopped at a hatch, not the one I'd found welded shut, but close to it. One of them unlocked it with a keycard. They went inside. I waited. 20 minutes passed. The ship creaked and settled around me, metal groaning like something in pain. I thought about leaving, about going back to my quarters and forgetting I'd seen anything, but I didn't move. When they came back out, the cart was empty. They locked the hatch again. Headed back up without speaking, without looking around. I stayed hidden until their footsteps faded. The next day, the unmarked tank was fuller than I'd ever seen it. The pipe was still dripping when I arrived for my shift, leaving dark streaks down its length. I started cleaning, same as always, but my hands were shaking. Kept thinking about that cart, about what could have been on it, about where it was now. I pulled something out of the tank that afternoon. Didn't want to look at it too closely, but I couldn't help it. It was a finger, small, the nail still painted with chipped blue polish. I dropped it back in, stepped away from the tank. The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls closer. I could hear my breathing inside the mask, too fast, too loud. I should have run, should have gone straight to Harkness, to someone, to anyone. But I just stood there, staring at the tank, at my hands, at the marks on the wall that had reached 43. I thought about the caps in my pocket. Thought about the food I'd been able to buy. About the fact that I wasn't hungry anymore. Wasn't trading away my possessions just to eat. Thought about what I'd have to go back to if I walked away. I finished my shift. That night I couldn't eat. Sat in my quarters with a tin of Brahmin meat I'd opened. Just stared at it until the smell made me sick. Ended up in the communal bathroom, heaving into a toilet while someone pounded on the door asking if I was all right. I wasn't all right. I hadn't been all right since I pulled that shirt out of the tank, but I said I was fine, said I'd eaten something bad, and they went away. I went back to work the next day. The superintendent was waiting at the hatch. He had that look again, the careful one, like he was measuring something he couldn't see. "You look tired," he said. "Haven't been sleeping well. The job getting to you?" I almost laughed, almost told him everything, what I'd found, what I'd seen, what I'd started to understand about where that unlabeled pipe really went. But then I thought about the last worker, about how they'd left suddenly, and I wondered if maybe they hadn't left at all. "Just need to adjust my sleep schedule," I said. "I'm fine." He studied me for a moment longer, then nodded. "Good, because we're very happy with your work. In fact, we'd like to expand your responsibilities." "Expand how?" "The medical section has some waste that needs special handling. Contaminated materials, specimens, that sort of thing. We'd need you to take on disposal duties for them as well. Significant increase in pay, of course." The medical section, where the security officers took their cart, where something ended up in that unmarked tank. "I'd need proper equipment," I heard myself say, "and hazard pay on top of the increase." He smiled. Not a happy smile, more like he'd confirmed something he'd suspected. "Of course. We'll have everything ready for you next shift." After he left, I sat on the floor next to the tanks, just sat there in the stink and the dark, and I tried to remember when exactly I'd decided to stop caring. Tried to pinpoint the moment when I'd gone from shocked to suspicious to complicit, but I couldn't find it. It had happened so gradually, so quietly, that I'd missed it entirely. The new duties started the following week. A security officer brought down 3 sealed containers, each marked with biohazard symbols that looked hand-drawn. He didn't say what was inside. Just told me to empty them into the unmarked tank at the end of each shift, then rinse the containers with the chemical solution they'd provided. The first container held pieces. That's all I could think to call them. Pieces of something that had been whole once. I didn't look closely. Just upended it into the tank, watched it splash and sink, then sealed the container again. The second held fluids, dark, thick, with sediment floating in it. Medical waste, probably. Specimens from the clinic. Nothing unusual, I told myself. Nothing wrong with disposing of medical waste. The third held personal effects. Clothing, mostly, but also small items, a watch, a necklace, a child's toy Brahmin with one horn missing. These should have gone to whoever handled lost and found, or to the belongings of deceased residents. But instead they were here, being dumped into a tank that fed into the filtration system. I emptied it anyway. The pay increase came through. 200 additional caps per week. I bought better food, traded for a decent pair of boots, started saving for a weapon. Kept telling myself I was being smart, being practical. In the wasteland, you survived by taking opportunities when they came. You didn't ask questions that might take those opportunities away. But at night, alone in my quarters, I'd think about that toy Brahmin sinking into the dark water. I'd wonder whose it had been. I'd wonder if they'd been looking for it. I saw Harkness less frequently. When we did cross paths, he'd nod but not stop to talk. I wondered if he knew about the expanded duties, about the containers, wondered if he'd known all along, and that's why he'd told me to come to him if I saw anything unusual, because he'd known I never would. One evening, someone knocked on my door. I opened it to find a woman I recognized from the market, middle-aged, weathered face, always selling scrap metal. She looked nervous. "You're the one who works in waste reclamation," she said. Not a question. "Yeah. My brother. He was security. Name was Connor. He disappeared 3 weeks ago." She swallowed hard. "They said he went topside on a patrol and never came back. But his things are still here. His bunk is still assigned. And I found this in his locker." She held out a piece of paper, folded and refolded until it was soft as cloth. I took it, opened it. It was a note, written in shaky handwriting. "If something happens to me, check the medical section." Lower deck. They're hiding something. Why are you showing me this? Because you work down there. Because you'd know if something was wrong. Her eyes were wet. Is my brother dead? I stood there holding her brother's note, and I thought about the unmarked tank, about the cart the security officers wheeled down every 3 days, about the finger with blue nail polish. I thought about the containers I emptied, about the personal effects that disappeared into dark water. I don't know, I said. It wasn't a lie. Not exactly. I didn't know for certain what happened in the medical section, didn't know what went into those containers before they reached me. I just suspected. Just had pieces of a picture I didn't want to finish. She took the note back, folded it carefully, held it against her chest like something precious. If you hear anything, she said, if you find anything, I'll let you know. Another lie. But she needed to hear it, and I needed her to leave so I could close the door and pretend this conversation had never happened. I didn't sleep that night, just lay on my bunk and stared at the ceiling and thought about a man named Connor who'd left a note for his sister. Thought about how he'd disappeared around the same time the unmarked tank had run particularly dark for several days. Thought about how I'd emptied 3 containers that week, how one of them had been heavier than usual. In the morning, I went to work. The security officer who delivered the containers was different this time. Younger, with a nervous twitch in his jaw. He set them down harder than necessary, like he wanted to be done with them as fast as possible. You ever wonder what's in these? He asked. I looked at him. He was watching me, waiting for something. A test, maybe. Or maybe he was like me, needing someone else to acknowledge what he already knew so it wouldn't just be his burden. No, I said. His face hardened. He picked up the empties from the previous shift and left without another word. I opened the first container. Inside were pieces again, but this time I recognized something, a patch of skin with a tattoo. Just a fragment, about the size of my palm. The tattoo showed an anchor, the kind security officers wore on their forearms. Standard issue for anyone who'd served in the Rivet City Guard. I dumped it into the tank, watched it sink. The second container held more fluids. Standard. Expected. I poured it in. The third held personal effects. Among the clothing and miscellaneous items, I found a security badge. The name engraved on it was Connor. I stood there holding it, this small piece of metal that proved everything I'd been avoiding. That confirmed what I'd been pretending not to know. Connor hadn't gone topside. He'd been disappeared, probably killed, and I'd been disposing of him, piece by piece, for the past 3 weeks. I should have taken the badge to his sister, should have taken it to Harkness, should have done something other than what I did. But I dropped it into the tank with everything else, and I watched it sink into the dark water. Then I cleaned the containers, stacked them by the hatch, finished my shift. I told myself it was about survival, that I needed this job, needed the caps, needed the stability. That in the wasteland, you couldn't afford principles. That one person couldn't change how things worked, and trying would just get you disappeared too. I told myself a lot of things that night. The work continued. The containers kept coming. I kept emptying them, kept cleaning the filters, kept maintaining the system that turned people into waste and waste into water. The water that fed the crops and the cooling systems and everything else that kept Rivet City running. I started noticing patterns in what came through. After certain people vanished, people who caused problems, people who asked too many questions, people who'd seen something they shouldn't have, the containers would appear. Not immediately, usually a few days later. Long enough for everyone to accept the story they'd been told about where that person had gone. The system was elegant, in its way. Efficient. Nobody had to see what happened. Nobody had to confront what was being done. There was just a smooth process that turned problems into nothing, and most people never knew they were drinking the solution. And I was part of it. An essential part. Without me, the system didn't work. Without me, there'd be evidence, questions, investigations. I was the one who made everything disappear cleanly, who kept the machine running. The superintendent gave me another raise after the second month. Said I was the best worker they'd had in the position, that I understood the importance of discretion, that I was valuable to Rivet City's operation. I took the caps, bought more food, better clothes, started saving seriously. Maybe enough for passage to another settlement eventually, somewhere I could start over doing something else. But I knew I wouldn't leave. Where else would I find work that paid this well? Where else could I eat regularly, sleep safely, have a locked door and a bunk? The wasteland didn't offer many opportunities. You took what you could get and you held on to it. Even if holding on to it meant emptying containers of your neighbors into a tank every few days. I stopped going to the market unless I had to. Stopped making eye contact with other residents. Started taking shifts at odd hours when fewer people were around. It was easier that way, not having to see their faces, not having to wonder if I'd be processing them next week. Connor's sister stopped me one more time, about a month after she'd shown me the note. She looked thinner, older, asked if I'd heard anything, found anything. No, I said. I'm sorry. She nodded, like she'd expected that answer. They told me he's officially listed as missing, presumed dead. They gave me his personal effects. She laughed, but it sounded wrong, broken. Except his badge is missing. They said he must have lost it before he disappeared. I felt the weight of that badge in my memory, felt it sinking through dark water. I'm sorry, I said again, because I didn't know what else to say. She walked away, and I watched her go, and I felt something inside me that might have been shame or guilt or just exhaustion. It was hard to tell anymore. I'd felt so many things over the past few months that they'd all started to blur together into a general numbness. That night, I dreamed about the tank. Dreamed I was inside it, sinking through the waste, through the fragments and fluids, down toward the bottom where everything accumulated. I could feel pieces of people brushing against me in the dark fingers, teeth, things that had once been whole. I tried to swim up, but the weight pulled me down, and I realized I was made of the same stuff now, that I'd been dissolving this whole time and hadn't noticed. I woke up gasping, my quarters dark and close, and for a moment I couldn't remember where I was or what I did for a living. Then it came back, and I wished I could go back to the dream. The work changed me in ways I didn't track at the time, small adjustments that seemed practical, necessary. I stopped reacting to what I found in the containers, stopped thinking about them as pieces of people and started thinking about them as just materials that needed processing. It was easier that way, more efficient. I developed systems. The containers arrived in a certain order, and I emptied them in that same order, following a routine that let me work without thinking too much. I timed my shifts to maximize efficiency, when to clean filters, when to check valves, when to dispose of the buckets. The work became almost meditative in its repetition. I stopped marking the wall. The count had become meaningless anyway. What difference did it make if I'd processed 50 people or 500? The number didn't change what I was doing or why. The superintendent praised my professionalism, said I had the right temperament for the work, that many people couldn't handle it. But I'd proven myself reliable. He gave me a key to the chemical storage room, told me I was trusted to manage my own supplies now. I felt proud of that, in a sick way. Proud that I was good at something, even if that something was disposal. In the wasteland, competence mattered. Skills kept you alive. This was just another skill, just another way of being useful. Harkness stopped by one afternoon, first time in weeks. He looked at the tanks, at the filters, at the clean workspace I'd maintained. Running smooth, he said. Always does. He was quiet for a moment, and I thought he might ask me something, might finally acknowledge what we both knew was happening. But he just nodded. You ever think about doing something else? He asked. Sometimes. But you don't. No. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something in his expression that might have been pity. Or maybe recognition, like he saw someone who'd made the same compromises he had, who'd chosen survival over conscience. Yeah, he said. Most people don't. After he left, I stood there thinking about that. About how most people, when offered a choice between comfort and morality, chose comfort. About how easy it was to justify, to rationalize, to tell yourself that you didn't really have a choice at all. About how I'd become one of those people without noticing the transition. Months passed. Seasons didn't mean much on the ship, but I could track time by the patterns in the waste, by the rotation of security officers who brought the containers, by the accumulation of caps in my hiding spot under my bunk. I'd saved almost 3,000 caps, enough to buy passage to another settlement, to set myself up somewhere else, enough to leave. But I didn't. Kept telling myself I'd go soon, once I had a little more saved, once I found the right opportunity, kept finding reasons to stay just a little longer. The truth was simpler. I'd gotten used to it. Used to the routine, the pay, the security of knowing exactly what each day would bring. I'd even gotten used to the smell, to the point where I barely noticed it anymore. My quarters didn't stink like they used to, or maybe they did, and I'd just stopped registering it. I'd become part of the system, not just a worker in it, but a piece of its machinery, as essential and thoughtless as the pipes and valves. One day I found a note in one of the containers. Someone had written it on a scrap of paper, stuffed it in with the personal effects. The writing was desperate, scratched out with something that had torn through the paper in places. "They're killing us. Medical section, lower deck. Tell someone, please." I stood there holding it, reading it over and over. Someone had written this knowing they were going to die, hoping against all odds that someone would find it and do something. And they'd been right. Someone had found it. I burned the note in the chemical burner we used for contaminated waste, watched the paper curl and blacken and turn to ash. Then I finished emptying the container, cleaned it, stacked it with the others. That's when I knew I was gone. Not physically, I was still here, still breathing, still functioning. But whatever part of me that could have done something different, that could have made another choice, was dead. Had died so slowly, I hadn't felt it happening. I'd become the thing the job needed me to be. The person who could process people into waste without flinching, who could burn a plea for help and go back to work, who could collect payment for silence and call it survival. The worst part wasn't the guilt. Guilt would have meant I still had something human left. The worst part was that I didn't feel much of anything anymore. Just a kind of hollow acceptance, a recognition that this was what I was now and what I'd always be. I thought about Connor's sister sometimes, about how she'd looked at me with hope, like I might be able to help. About how I'd let her walk away, still believing her brother had just disappeared into the wasteland somewhere. I thought about all the others, too. The people whose names I'd never known, whose pieces I'd processed without acknowledgement. How many had there been? How many more would there be? I didn't know. Didn't want to know. That kind of accounting seemed pointless. The work continued. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. I showed up for my shifts, did what needed doing, collected my pay, lived in my quarters, ate my meals, slept when I could. It was a life. Not a good one, maybe, but it was something. And in the wasteland, having something was more than most people managed. The superintendent started giving me additional responsibilities, handling special disposals that needed to happen quickly, quietly, training me on procedures for emergencies, how to increase filtration capacity if there was a sudden influx, how to deal with complications in the system. I learned it all, became an expert in the machinery of disappearance. One night, a security officer I didn't recognize came down during my shift. He stood in the doorway, not coming inside, just watching me work. "You ever get used to it?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Eventually you do. That's supposed to be comforting?" "It's just the truth." He left without saying anything else, but I could feel his judgment hanging in the air after he'd gone. He was new, I figured, still had that freshness, that sense that things should be different than they were. Give him time, give him enough shifts bringing down those containers, and he'd learn the same lessons I had. You either accepted how things worked, or you became waste yourself. I pulled something from the tank that afternoon that made me stop. It was a holotape, sealed in a waterproof case. Someone had gone to considerable effort to protect it, to make sure it survived the disposal process. I dried it off, held it up to the light. Inside the case, the holotape looked intact. I should have destroyed it immediately, should have known that it contained something dangerous, something I didn't want to know. But my hands moved on their own, opening the case, pulling out the tape. There was a holotape player in the supervisor's office, up past the residential decks. I could use it before my next shift, when the office was empty. I told myself I was just curious, that it probably wasn't anything important, that even if it was, I wouldn't do anything with the information anyway, so what did it matter? But I pocketed the tape, finished my shift, locked up the waste reclamation room. The office was empty when I got there, just like I'd expected. I closed the door, inserted the tape into the player, pressed play. A man's voice came through, low and strained. He was whispering, like he was afraid of being heard. "This is Dr. Richards, logging a personal note because the official records won't reflect this. The council has authorized medical experiments on detained residents. They're calling it disease research, saying it's necessary for the settlement's survival. But there's no oversight, no ethics review. They're bringing us people, criminals, mostly, or people who've caused problems, and we're supposed to use them for testing. Some of the experiments are legitimate medical research, I guess. Radiation treatment protocols, testing remedies for common wasteland diseases. But some of it," his voice wavered, "some of it is just seeing what we can do, how much pain someone can endure, how long they survive different conditions, how they react to various compounds." I tried to object, tried to refuse, but then they suggested my daughter might benefit from a more careful allocation of medical resources, made it clear that cooperation was expected. So, I've been doing it, administering the experiments, documenting the results, disposing of the subjects when they expire. I don't know who's going to hear this, or if anyone will. I don't know if it matters. But I needed to say it, to put it into words. What we're doing is wrong, and I'm doing it anyway. And I don't know if that makes me a monster or just a coward. Maybe there's not much difference. The tape ended. Silence filled the office. I sat there for a long time, just staring at the holotape player. The tape had confirmed what I'd suspected, given shape to what I'd been pretending not to know. The medical section wasn't just disposing of inconvenient people, they were using them first, experimenting on them, and then sending them to me when they were done. I thought about Dr. Richards, forced into participation through threats to his daughter, about how he'd chosen to protect her at the cost of however many people he'd hurt, about how he'd made the same calculation I'd made, that survival of someone you cared about was worth the suffering of people you didn't, about how that made us both complicit, both guilty. I ejected the tape, held it in my hand. I could take it to Harkness, could expose what was happening, could maybe stop it, or I could destroy it and go back to work. Keep my head down, keep collecting my pay, keep surviving. I thought about Connor's sister, about the note I'd burned, about all the containers I'd emptied without question, about what Dr. Richards had said. Maybe there's not much difference between monster and coward. I put the tape back in its case, sealed it, walked back down to waste reclamation. The unmarked tank was running when I got there, a slow drip from the pipe feeding it. I unsealed the case, pulled out the holotape, held it over the tank. Just drop it, I thought. Let it sink. Let it disappear with everything else. But my hands wouldn't move. I stood there frozen, the tape poised over the water, and I felt something cracking inside me. Not guilt, not shame. Just a kind of exhaustion so profound it felt like dying. I'd come down here thinking I'd destroy the tape, that I'd make the practical choice, the survivor's choice. But I couldn't make my hands let go. Some last stubborn part of me was refusing to cooperate. I lowered the tape, sealed the case again, put it in my pocket. I finished my shift on autopilot, going through the motions while my mind churned. Kept thinking about what was on that tape, about what it meant, about what happened to people like Dr. Richards who tried to object, about what happened to people like me who knew and said nothing. When my shift ended, I didn't lock up right away. I just sat on the floor next to the tanks, listening to the drip of the pipes, feeling the weight of the tape in my pocket. I'd survived by becoming what the system needed, had traded pieces of myself for security, for comfort, for the illusion of safety. And now I had a choice: destroy the evidence and keep surviving, or do something that might destroy me instead. It wasn't really a choice. Not anymore. I'd made too many compromises already, swallowed too many truths, processed too many people into nothing. If I destroyed the tape, there'd be nothing left of me worth preserving anyway. I stood up, locked the waste reclamation room, started walking toward the upper decks. Harkness lived in the officers' quarters, a section I'd never visited. I didn't know his exact room, but I asked a passing crew member and they pointed me in the right direction. Looked at me strangely. Someone from my position rarely came to this section but didn't question it. I knocked on his door, waited. It was late, past midnight, but I could hear movement inside. He opened the door in a t-shirt and pants, looking tired. When he saw me, his expression shifted surprise, then something like resignation. "I was wondering when you'd show up," he said. "You knew?" "Yeah, I knew." He stepped back. "Come in." His quarters were bigger than mine, but not by much. Still the same metal walls, same utilitarian furniture. He'd tried to make it personal with a few pre-war photographs on the wall, a bookshelf made from scrap wood. It looked like someone trying to build a home inside a machine. "You want to tell me what brings you here?" he asked, closing the door. I pulled out the holotape, set it on his desk. He looked at it, then at me. "Where'd you find that?" "In one of the disposal containers. Someone went to a lot of effort to preserve it." "And you didn't destroy it?" "No." "Why not?" I didn't have a good answer, just shook my head. Harkness picked up the tape, turned it over in his hands. "You know what this means? What happens if you give this to me?" "I have an idea. You'll lose your job, probably be detained while we investigate, might be disappeared yourself, depending on how this plays out." He set the tape down. "You thought about that?" "Yeah. And you're giving it to me anyway." "I don't know what else to do with it." He laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "Most people would have dropped it in the tank, pretended they never saw it. I tried, couldn't do it. That's going to make your life very hard." "It's already hard." He was quiet for a moment, studying me. Then he picked up the tape again. "I can't promise this will change anything. The people running this operation, they're part of the council. They have power, influence. Even if I expose this, they might find a way to bury it. But you'll try." "Yeah, I'll try." He looked at the tape again. "You understand you're trusting me with this? That I could just destroy it myself, tell you I'll investigate, and nothing would change?" "I understand. So why take the risk?" I thought about that. About all the months of processing people into waste, all the containers I'd emptied, all the compromises I'd made. About Connor's badge sinking through dark water, about the note I'd burned, about Dr. Richards' voice on the tape admitting his cowardice. "Because I'm tired of being part of it," I said. Harkness nodded slowly. "Yeah, I know that feeling." He told me to go back to my quarters, to act normal, to wait. Said he'd need time to figure out how to move forward, who he could trust. Said it might be days or weeks before anything happened, if anything happened at all. I left his quarters and walked back down through the ship, past the residential sections where people slept safely, past the markets where they'd trade tomorrow, past all the ordinary life that depended on systems they didn't see and didn't want to know about. I went back to waste reclamation, stared at the tanks, at the pipes, at the workspace I'd maintained for months. I knew I couldn't work here anymore, couldn't empty those containers, couldn't maintain that system, not after everything. But I also knew I couldn't just walk away. That would raise questions, draw attention. So I went through the motions, checked the filters, monitored the valves, cleaned the workspace, made everything look normal while my mind spun through what might happen next. 3 days later, security officers came for me. Not the ones who usually brought containers, different ones, serious and silent. They escorted me to a holding area in the lower decks, told me to wait. I sat in that small room for hours, listening to footsteps outside, voices I couldn't quite hear, wondering if Harkness had done what he'd said, or if this was punishment for giving him the tape. Finally, the door opened. But it wasn't Harkness who came in. It was the superintendent and 2 council members I recognized from settlement meetings. They sat down across from me. The superintendent looked disappointed, like I'd failed a test he'd been hoping I'd pass. "We understand you've made some allegations," one of the council members said. A woman, older, with sharp eyes. "Regarding activities in the medical section." I gave evidence to security. Evidence. She said it like the word was funny. "A holotape of unknown origin, found in waste you were processing. For all we know, you created it yourself. Why would I do that? Who knows? Maybe you wanted attention. Maybe you were trying to cause problems. Maybe you've just been down in that room too long, breathing in all those fumes, and you've started to see things that aren't there." The superintendent leaned forward. "We gave you a good job, paid you well, trusted you with sensitive work, and this is how you repay that trust. People are being killed. People disappear in the wasteland all the time," the woman said. "That's just reality. What you're suggesting, that Rivet City, the safest settlement on the Potomac, is murdering its own residents, is absurd. I've been disposing of them for months." "You've been disposing of waste. Medical waste, primarily, which in the wasteland often includes remains of people who've died from disease, injury, radiation exposure. That's the nature of the work." She looked at me with something like pity. "I think you've let the isolation get to you. Started connecting things that aren't connected. Built a narrative that isn't real." I wanted to argue. Wanted to list everything I'd seen, everything I'd found. But looking at their faces, I realized they weren't here to listen. They were here to make sure I understood something. "Here's what's going to happen," the woman continued. "You're going to admit that you made a mistake, that you misinterpreted what you saw, that you let the stress of the job affect your judgment. And in return, we're going to overlook this incident. You'll be reassigned to different work, something less isolated. We'll call it a medical leave, a chance for you to recover. And if I don't," the superintendent answered, "then we'll have to conclude you're unstable, a danger to yourself and others. You'll be committed to medical evaluation for your own protection." Medical evaluation, in the same section where Dr. Richards conducted his experiments. They left me alone to think about it. I sat in that room and understood clearly what was happening. They were offering me a way back into the system, a chance to retreat and survive. All I had to do was recant, pretend I'd been wrong, go back to being a functioning part of the machine. Or I could refuse and become waste myself. Harkness came to see me before I had to answer. He looked tired, defeated. "I tried," he said. "Went to council with the tape. They listened to it, discussed it, then told me it wasn't sufficient evidence. Said the voice could be anyone, that the claims couldn't be verified." "Did you believe them?" "No. I think they're covering it up. Think some of them know about it, maybe even authorized it." He sat down heavily. "But I can't prove it. And I can't protect you. What happens now? That depends on you. They've made you an offer, recant and accept reassignment. It's a good offer, considering. You'd be alive, employed, safe. And if I don't?" He didn't answer right away, just looked at me with those tired eyes, and I saw in them all the compromises he'd made, all the things he'd learned to overlook to keep doing his job. "Then they'll make you disappear," he said finally. "And I won't be able to stop it. Would you try?" "I'd like to think so. But honestly, I don't know. I've got a job to do, a settlement to protect." Sometimes that means making hard choices about who to save and who to sacrifice. He stood up. I'm sorry. For what it's worth, I am sorry. But this is bigger than both of us. After he left, I sat in silence and thought about all the choices that had led to this moment. Thought about how I'd taken the job because I was hungry, how I'd stayed because I was comfortable, how I'd processed people into waste because it was easier than questioning the system, how I'd finally tried to do something right and it hadn't mattered at all. The council members came back the next morning. I gave them the answer they wanted, said I'd made a mistake, misinterpreted things, let the isolation affect my judgment. The words tasted like ash, but I said them. They looked satisfied. Told me I'd made the right choice, that I'd be reassigned to maintenance work in the upper decks, something with more social contact, better for my mental health. They let me out of the holding area, gave me new duty assignments, told me to take a few days to rest before starting the new position. I went back to my quarters, lay on my bunk, stared at the ceiling and tried to feel something: relief, guilt, anything. But there was just numbness. I'd survived. That's what mattered, right? I'd made it through. Still had a job, a place to sleep, food to eat. In the wasteland, that was winning. But it didn't feel like winning. I started the maintenance work a week later, fixing pipes, replacing wiring, all the routine tasks that kept the settlement running. The work was easy, mindless. I went through the motions, did what I was told, collected my pay. People nodded to me in the corridors now. I wasn't the outcast from waste reclamation anymore. I was just another worker, ordinary and unremarkable. I passed Connor's sister in the market once. She didn't recognize me at first. I'd cleaned up, looked more normal. When she did, her eyes widened slightly, like she was going to say something. But then she just looked away and kept walking. She knew. Somehow she knew I'd done nothing to help her brother, that I'd let him disappear without even trying. I wanted to go after her, to explain. But what would I say? That I'd tried and failed? That I'd compromised and survived? That I was sorry but not sorry enough to have done anything differently? I let her go. Months passed. The routine of maintenance work settled over me like sediment. I fixed things that broke. I kept systems running. I went to my quarters at night and slept, and I didn't dream about the tanks anymore. I heard that waste reclamation got a new worker. Heard they didn't last long, quit after 2 weeks. The position stayed empty for a while after that, and I wondered if the system was breaking down without me, if they were having trouble finding someone else willing to do what I'd done. Then I heard they'd filled the position again, someone from outside the settlement who needed the caps badly enough not to ask questions. The system was working again. I saw Harkness occasionally on my maintenance rounds. We didn't talk much, just nodded in passing. Two people who'd briefly tried to change something and failed. One day I was working on a pipe junction in the lower decks, not far from waste reclamation. I could smell it, that familiar mix of sewage and chemicals and rot. And under it, that sweet smell I'd never quite identified. I thought about going in, checking on the new worker, seeing if the system was being maintained properly. But I didn't. Just finished my work and moved on. That evening, sitting in my quarters eating my dinner, I realized I'd stopped thinking about the containers, about what had been in them, about the people they'd been. It had faded into the background of my memory. Just another thing that had happened, no more significant than any other aspect of surviving in the wasteland. I'd become what I'd tried to avoid, not someone who processed waste, but someone who processed horror into routine, who could carry knowledge of atrocity and file it away under things that happened and move on. I finished my dinner, cleaned my plate, prepared for the next day's work. Outside my quarters, Rivet City continued functioning. People lived their lives, unaware or uncaring about the systems that kept them safe. They ate food grown in soil fertilized by water from the filtration system. They walked corridors cleaned with that same water. They built their lives on a foundation of disappeared people and buried secrets. And I was part of that foundation now. Not in the way I'd been before, directly processing the waste, but in a deeper way, as someone who knew the truth and chose to live with it anyway. Sometimes I thought about the holotape, about Dr. Richard's confession, wondered what had happened to him and his daughter, wondered if they'd survived, if they'd found a way to live with what he'd done. Mostly, I just tried not to think about it, tried to focus on the work in front of me, on the immediate tasks that needed completing. That's what survival required, narrowing your focus, limiting your awareness, not looking too hard at the larger picture. I got good at it, better than I'd expected. The human mind is adaptable like that. It can file away almost anything, make room for whatever it needs to function. Years passed. I kept working maintenance, kept living in my quarters, kept existing in the settlement built on bones I'd helped process. I never went back to waste reclamation, never checked to see if they were still using that unmarked tank, still feeding waste into the filtration system. I told myself it was because I didn't need to know, because it wasn't my responsibility anymore. Truth was, I was afraid I'd find out they'd stopped. That maybe after the holotape incident, they'd changed procedures, cleaned up their operation. And if they had stopped, that would mean all the months I'd spent there had been for nothing. That I'd sold myself for a system that could have ended earlier if I'd just spoken up sooner. Or worse, I was afraid I'd find out they hadn't stopped. That the system was still running, still processing people into nothing, and my confession had changed nothing at all. So I didn't look, just kept my head down and did my work, and collected my pay. That's the truth of it, I suppose. The real cost of the job wasn't the work itself, wasn't the smell, or the horror, or the physical labor of processing people into waste. It was learning how to live with what I'd become. How to wake up each morning and go through the motions of life while carrying the weight of all those containers, all those pieces, all that evidence I'd destroyed or ignored or processed into nothing. It was understanding that I'd had chances to stop it, to speak up, to do something, and I'd chosen safety over conscience every single time until the choice had calcified into habit. It was recognizing that I'd become exactly what the system needed me to be, not just a worker who could do the job, but a person who could do the job and live with themselves afterward, who could compartmentalize, rationalize, survive. The worst part wasn't the guilt or the shame or the knowledge of what I'd done. The worst part was how easy it became to push it all aside and keep going. How the mind adapted, how the horror faded into background noise, how eventually it just became part of who I was, rather than something that defined me. I survived. That's what matters in the wasteland, right? That's the only real measure of success. I found work that kept me fed. I kept my head down when it mattered. I made the choices necessary to stay alive. And if those choices required processing people into waste, if they required burning evidence and swallowing truths and learning to live with the weight of complicity, well, that was just the cost of survival. That was just what the wasteland required. Everyone who makes it has done something they can't take back. Everyone carries weight they'd rather not carry. I'm not special. I'm not worse than anyone else. I'm just someone who found out what they were willing to become in order to keep breathing. And I became it. That's the job, really. Not processing waste, not cleaning filters or maintaining systems. The job is processing yourself, taking whatever principles or conscience or humanity you started with and feeding them through the same system, the same tanks, until they dissolve into something you can live with. Until you become the kind of person who can do what needs doing without it destroying you. Or maybe it does destroy you, but in such a gradual way that you don't notice until you're gone. I still live in Rivet City, still work maintenance, still nod to people in the corridors and trade at the market and exist within the framework of normal life. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about Connor's badge sinking through dark water, about the note I burned, about Dr. Richard's voice on that holotape admitting his cowardice, about how he said maybe there's not much difference between monster and coward. He was wrong about that. There's no difference at all.